All right, Tony, I don't know if you had a chance to prep a lot of Penn State. What I would say here is we know the talent of Drew Allar, although he's had his road struggles against the likes of Illinois and Northwestern in the Big Ten. The running game has not been as dynamic as I had thought it would be, which is supposed to feature the best offensive line during the James Franklin era, and two, of course, dynamite freshman, now sophomore running backs. I think the outside threats aren't what they've been in the past with Jahan Dotson and others, Chris Godwin. They don't have that guy, it appears, and they've got another tight end who should be playing on Sundays at some point.
Yeah, you say Drew Allar, they've got the talent there. I agree, he's talented, but it's not. I don't think it's showing offensively yet. You look at the number of downfield plays, and I've not gotten to see Penn State much this year, but you look at the numbers, and they've got one play of 40 yards this season on offense compared to 11 for Ohio State. They're not stretching the field nearly enough. As you said, they're not running the ball very well. And I feel like they're getting overlooked because people aren't watching them, so they just assume the offense is doing well, and you see 63 points against UMass or whatever, and you see 60-something against Delaware, and that's who they are offensively. But they need to do something more, and they're doing more than Iowa, but that's not necessarily a measuring stick. So I think Allar, they have talent. I'm not sure about the receivers, how talented they are. I don't know if maybe that's what's holding them back right now. But I'm surprised at the lack of explosion offensively this season.
Well, Tony, for as much as we appreciate your Penn State breakdown, we got the guy here who knows a little bit more about those Nittany Lions, who are off to an undefeated start, of course. We got Mark Brennan here from Lions 247 Sports. Mark, how you doing this afternoon?
Great. I'm glad this game week is finally here, man. This is going to be a lot of fun.
I'm telling you, we were just running through the Penn State offense, and you can let us know better than certainly us and our audience here that has been watching Ohio State football start to finish, starting with that game against West Virginia. We had heard in the offseason that this would be the best Penn State offensive line that we've seen since Joe Pa. Has that materialized?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also been the deepest offensive line, and that's ended up being important because they lost one of their starting guards in Landon Tangwell, who had to retire from the sport. And then the guy who replaced him, J.B. Nelson, has missed the last game and a half, and they were able to actually bring some younger players up, and it's helped. So not only are you looking at Olu Fashanu, who's, I think everybody's projecting as a top 10 pick in the NFL draft, but the level of depth they had, to me, I think was at a level that we haven't really seen since those mid-90s teams. So that's been really important for them. But I overheard, definitely. I mean, if you're looking at one thing from this offense, they've put up a ton of points. They have this ridiculous streak of 30-point games, but the explosive plays, just have not been there. And I think the key question is, have they just been winning so easily that they haven't had to show it? Or is it just not there? And I don't think we're going to really know that until this Saturday, when I have a feeling they're going to have to open up their entire playbook.
Mark, great to see you.
Yes,
We've been friends and acquaintances since the mid-90s. That goes back a few years. What was your first year covering Penn State football on a full-time basis?
1988.
Wow.
So, yeah, I just turned 60, so I've been in the game for a while. And believe me, knowing that I was turning 60, there were some people on the network who gave me a pretty good hard time about it. But yeah, so I've seen a lot of Penn State football, but it's fun. I mean, I live in State College, so it's a cool place to live. It's been a good program to cover, other than a couple years there. But overall, I've been in it for a while, and have always valued your friendship and across multiple networks, and have always appreciated the professional work that we've seen from you in particular, Steve, and Bucknuts in general.
Well, thank you. I think we can all. I'm 55, so we have to be thankful that CBS does not age discriminate. So that's a good thing. But James Franklin, 10th year, and obviously just the one win over Ohio State,
Yeah.
and they play every year. And what's crazy is we all got up in arms, at least some of us did, that they were ending the Penn State series with the jumble with USC and USCLA joining the conference and the way things were going to be mixed around. But then they bring Oregon and Washington in. They put all the chips back in the bag and they shuffled them up. And now Ohio State and Penn State are still going to play the next 2 years. So it's not, the hiatus doesn't begin till 2026. But at any rate, with Franklin, I know there's a glass ceiling, or it seems like there's been a glass ceiling that they punched up against to try and get into the playoff and all these other things. And, you know, in your mind, is this a team that has what it takes to win at least one of these two showdown games and at least get into a tiebreaker scenario, which we laid those out with Iowa beating Wisconsin? Penn State's now kind of got the upper hand in the tiebreaker scenario.
Yeah, I mean, and sooner or later you have to, right? I mean, Penn State hasn't beaten Ohio State and Michigan when both teams were ranked since 2008. So this predates Franklin. I mean, this isn't only a James Franklin thing. This is something where, you know, Penn State comes into the Big Ten in the early 90s and in 94 runs the table. And I think everybody thought, oh, man, you know, this is just going to be same old, same old. But clearly, when you look at the Big Ten, and with all respect to what Michigan's been able to do the last couple of years, the team you have to beat to prove that you're the man is Ohio State. And this is the most talent that James Franklin has had. And don't read that the wrong way, because yes, when they had Saquon Barkley and Chris Godwin and, you know, Micah Parsons and all those players, they had great individual players in different spots. I'm talking about depth. I'm talking about across the board. I think if you project out where a lot of these guys are going to be when it comes around to the NFL draft, if you look at it really closely, the depth of talent is there. So everything is in place. And I think the other thing about Penn State, Ohio State is that Penn State has been there in these games. Penn State has led these games in the fourth quarter and let them slip away. And you could look at it a different way. You can say that Ohio State has grabbed those games and seized them and won them. But yeah, to be at that level, to be the man, you got to beat the man. And there is, did you already say that? You know, you have to be able to take care of business. And I think a lot of fans are looking at this. Listen, James Franklin is on any sort of hot seat, because I think any rational person, if they look at the dumpster fire that he inherited and able to get them to a Big Ten title as soon as they did, and able to establish the program where it is and improve the facilities and do all these things, he's done an unbelievable job. But everybody keeps talking about that next level, that next level. Well, this is where you have to take care of business against one of these two teams. And I think it's important this year, Steve and guys, because, you know, when you expand the playoffs, then it's going to be much easier, obviously. I mean, for people to get in. But if you want to prove that you can be one of those teams, you got to beat at least one of these teams this year. And I think that's absolutely fair criticism. One thing I would say is that, you know, it's going to be interesting to see, because I think they're in a better spot now defensively. I didn't dislike Brent Pry as a coach, but the job that Manny Diaz has been doing has been unbelievable. Now, that's going to be tested this week, but I think if you look at his body of work over the first two seasons, outside of that one terrible game at Michigan last year, they've done some pretty impressive things. And I think his offense is starting to come around and kind of click again outside of the big plays.
Losing what they did in the secondary and then not missing a beat, I think, is incredibly impressive. How much, because I write about Michigan every week as well, and they have played nobody offensively. Penn State is in that same boat. So how much Penn State leading the nation in yards given up and yards per play allowed. Ohio State's number 2 in yards per play allowed. I believe this is a legit defense, but have they been tested at any point by anybody? Like, what's been the biggest test for them offensively this season?
No, I mean, West Virginia scored 15 points, I think, and a guy from Delaware popped a 68-yard run or something. But it's like they're really talented, and it was kind of funny. They play this game against UMass, and I don't even know who the offensive coordinator of UMass is, but UMass kept trying to run wide, and it's like, the one thing, if you look at this team and where it struggled last year, it was people gashing them up the middle, especially Michigan, because they didn't have the biggest defensive tackles. And I think they've improved that. But, I mean, even Ohio State, I think, will have trouble attacking the edges. Trying to run wide against this team just doesn't work because it's super fast. And I think if you're going to beat them, it's going to be with the passing game, or it's going to be running up the gut. So I just think that level of speed at all three levels is what's been the real key. But no, they haven't been tested. We were just doing our own podcast, and I was asked, hey, what's the biggest question mark? It's like, yeah, these guys have been rolling through everybody. What's going to happen when they get punched in the mouth and have to make a play in the fourth quarter? They haven't. I mean, their starting defensive tackles last week played 13 and 14 snaps. They had the game against Iowa. Their defense, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I think the defense played 32 or something snaps in the entire game. So they have been able to, but I think the positive is they have been able to limit how much their key defensive players have been out on the field. And if you take a look at the numbers, it's absolutely crazy. So if you look, let me scroll up here if you guys don't mind. I'm sorry I'm doing this as I'm on the air.
Go for it.
But yeah, their leading tackler through 6 games is Curtis Jacobs with 23 tackles. A dude from Iowa had 18 tackles in one game. I mean, and so you have Curtis Jacobs with 23. Dom DeLuca, former walk-on, has 16. And this isn't a negative for Penn State because they've not played guys. They've been like beating people, so badly that they've been able to rest these guys up. And I think where that could pay dividends, and we'll see. I think we'll find out this week. Number one, in the fourth quarter against an elite opponent, but number two, in late October, which we're hitting, and then late November, and then into November, when the strength of schedule really picks up.
33 plays against Iowa, 76 yards. You'll have to do the math for me, but I think that's pretty darn good. Maybe a yard and a half, 2.5 per play, if that. Mark, one quick one from me would be more about the defense that, there are a few teams across the nation that have NFL players on all three levels, just like packing out the unit. But it's not just that. These NFL draft boards love this Penn State defense. We're not just talking NFL projections. We're talking first, second rounders.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, and that's what I said, Manny Diaz, to me, and it started last year. They went out to Purdue and opened the season at Purdue. And James Franklin has this whole thing about them starting on the Big Ten and on the road like every year for the last, 30 years or something. I don't know what it is, but like, who cares where you're starting? You're going to play the same number of games. But the one thing that jumped out to everybody in that game was, even with Joey Porter Jr. last year, they were rotating him out significantly. Kalen King didn't start the last game. I mean, that's how deep they are. And he's not afraid to use the depth. And I think one thing that if you saw it with Brent Pry is some of these guys, I think some of the times when they would get into the fourth quarter against an Ohio State, guys were just so gassed. So let's see if that actually makes a difference or not. It's kind of funny because somebody asked me last week, looking ahead to the Ohio State game, Ohio State's been in multiple close games, Mark. Do you think that's going to benefit them because Penn State has? And I said, well, the last 6 years, Penn State's been in a bunch of close games before playing Ohio State. It hasn't made a damn difference. So let's, maybe going with this approach is going to work. But in all seriousness, yeah, I mean, I think the amount of talent they have and the depth that they have and Manny Diaz's willingness to rotate guys in and rotate them out. When you watch this defense, there are going to be a couple of guys to really keep an eye on. One is Abdul Carter, because he can play either box linebacker position, and they play a lot of nickel. They play a lot of prowler, which is like 6 defensive backs. But Abdul Carter is one of those versatile pieces who can go almost anywhere. And one of their DBs, Johnny Dixon, he's not the high-profile guy that Kalen King is, but he will be everywhere. And again, he'll be on the field. He's going to play a ton of snaps, but they will play him up as their prowler, which is a defensive back that they'll bring up near the line of scrimmage, and they won't be afraid to rush him. But those are two real key guys to keep an eye on. When you talk about the depth that they have, those are two guys who will be on the field as much as anybody.
Mark, you mentioned James Franklin and the level of satisfaction from the fan base. Think about this. It's been 5 years. I believe it was after that 2018, comeback, Dwayne Haskins, 27-26, that he made the comment, Franklin, after the game, we're great, but they're elite and we need to get there. So there was already some built up angst and, hey, some patience running out. And that was 5 years ago. And here we are in 2023, and Penn State still looking for a win for the first time since 16.
Yeah, one thing about Franklin, he's very good with the media, so I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but I think sometimes after games, like a lot of coaches, he says things that he wishes he didn't say. And that's one of those things that I'm sure, all these years later, he's probably wishing he didn't say. But it goes back to what we were talking about before. I mean, let's just be realistic about it. I mean, if you want to be the team in the Big Ten, you have to beat the team. And to me, with all due respect to Michigan, it's that team is still Ohio State. So let's see if he's able to actually get past that. And again, I think it's important to do it this year while you're still in the division. I think the division setup has been ridiculous for the Big Ten, like just stupid, because the East is so loaded. But it is what Penn State's had to deal with. And with this ending after this year, we think, because who knows, it could change in 2 months if they add 6 more teams. But with this ending this year, to be able to get at least one of these teams when they're good, they've beaten Michigan when Michigan hasn't been very good. But to get one of these teams when they're good is really important for him. And again, I'm not suggesting by a million miles that his job's on the line. But if you want to be considered at that level, and excuse me, he was the one who talked about being elite. You have to beat an elite team.
Got a quick stat for you, Mark, and then I'll cut these guys loose and they'll take us home. But with those 2 wins by Ohio State and Michigan last week, these 3 are 34-0 against the rest of the Big Ten. They've won 34 consecutive games since Penn State lost to Michigan State, the final game of 21. And just focusing on Ohio State, since they walked off the field against Purdue in 2018 in that shocking loss, they are 37-0 against the entire Big Ten outside of Michigan, 2-2 against Michigan, 37-0 against everyone else. Actually, if you measure the entire divisions against each other, they're almost 500 against each other. It's just where it counts, obviously, has not even been anywhere close.
Yeah. I just look at, and we talk about, the strength of these teams and everything else. I computed what the caliber of the opposing offenses has been for Penn State. And I think a couple of these teams like Iowa and Northwestern are in the 100s nationally. And the average ranking of those teams is like around 100. The average ranking of the teams Ohio State's played is around 70. And I only looked at the 5 FBS schools. Of course, both of them played an FCS school. Yeah. I don't know that means, the world or anything, but it does kind of speak to the fact that if there were anemic offenses that Penn State could find to play against, they certainly did play them. And we saw it last year up until the game where Ohio State played Maryland and then played Michigan and then played Georgia. Well, Penn State was a pretty good offense as well. But until that last quadrant of the season, Ohio State played nobody. I mean, some of the absolute worst offenses this year or any other year. And so I guess my question before I had one about Allar is this defense, can we take it, for real, what we're seeing? I mean, you beat Iowa 31-0, but, Iowa's proven they can hardly, 15 points. I mean, it's like, I don't know. What do you think?
Iowa's got a great punter, man. Iowa has a great punter. All right.
He's their best offensive weapon.
But no, I think if you dial back to what they did last year, after the losing to 2 of 3 and see what they did defensively overall, including against Utah. You know, they've played pretty well. Have they played at a level of allowing whatever they're doing this year, which is what, 8 or 9 points? No,
Yeah,
of course
absurd.
not. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, but yeah. So to your point, I think part of it does have to do with the opponent, but I think they kind of set they started to set a tone toward the end of last season. And they actually, you know, they carried that into the Utah game, knocked the quarterback out of that game, which you didn't want to see, but really kind of dominated that game. So I think overall defensively, they've been pretty good since losing that 2 of 3 stretch in the middle of last season with Ohio State and Michigan. And I think Minnesota was in the middle of there. So I think overall they've played pretty well defensively, that I don't think you could just look at this 6-game stretch and say, you know, they haven't played anybody. I think if you look at the level of talent they have, it's pretty good. And again, it's going to be a completely different test this week. Absolutely no question about it.
I'll just throw in on Allar, a lot of angst in Ohio and Ohio State fans that Ohio State didn't, you know, go after Allar or whatever, but they did have Stroud and they did have McCord in the fold at that time. You know, McCord's now in his 3rd year at Ohio State. To your mind, what is it about Allar that has been, you know, special as he's taken over, and how can he continue to grow? What's the next step for him after these first 5 or 6 games as the starter?
Yeah, one thing, just going back to the recruiting that you were talking about. I mean, remember that Penn State was in on him before. I mean, I think he was a 3-star when they got in, and they really set a tone there. And to some kids, you know, that makes a difference. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's wrong. But they were in on him before he became a 5-star and blew up, and everybody was kind of looking at him. But look at his numbers. I mean, he's, you know, you're sitting there at, you know, 12 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. I mean, for a first-year starter,
yeah,
I don't care who you're playing. And what he's done, he's been very patient. And I remember talking to James Franklin before the season, and one thing he said is, you know, what we need for this kid to do is not be afraid to throw the ball away. And it's okay to settle for a punt, you know, and that's what he's done. And if you look at their offense, and I'm not going to include last week's game because it was such a blowout, but overall, I don't know that before last week he threw more than 4 or 5 passes, more than 20 yards downfield all season. And I think one of them was his 2nd pass of the year, which went for 72 yards to Keandre Lambert-Smith. But I'm saying that because I think what they've done is allowed him to succeed without taking a bunch of chances and build his confidence. He's only been sacked a handful of times. So they've put him in a position to be successful. And I think what he's done is he's bought into that. He's not forced things. He's if you talk to him after a game, you know, he has those leadership qualities. He doesn't get frustrated if he doesn't have a big game, but Penn State still wins, or if he doesn't have a bunch of touchdown passes, but they still win. And you could just see kind of the level of confidence he's to this point. And again, you know, we saw what happened with Penn State last year when Ohio State was able to get a little bit of a pass rush going. You know, to this point, even when he's been hit, he's been kind of unflappable. So that, to me, has been the most impressive part of this kid so far. Everybody talks about how strong his arm is, and you will see him make throws. It's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to go 70 yards down the field. He can make throws on outs and stuff that you'll be like, wow. I mean, that arm strength is just unbelievable. But it's beyond that. I just think it's the way he carries himself, that he's, again, allowed himself to get into a position where he's not making the key mistakes that have taken this team apart, or taken it that have cost it games, you know, in the past, you know, during the 17 year Sean Clifford career.
With that short passing game, is this a byproduct of coverage, or is this a byproduct of Drew Allar's preference? Because I've heard people talking about how much he's checking down and things like that. Is it just 2 safeties over top most of the time, and there's nothing downfield is not where you want to go, especially for a relatively young starting quarterback? That's one of the things that gets pounded into their brain. Don't throw into double coverage. And so you're kind of cautious by default. At what point does that caution start to go away and maybe the bravado start coming out.
Yeah, that's what everybody's wondering, right? Because it has been what you've been saying. Teams have really gone out of their way to do two things, limit the run as best they can, and then not be beaten deep. And to his credit, he's taken what's been there underneath. He's not, again, it's that can't be the easiest thing, because if you see how far this guy can throw the ball, it's like, wow, I mean, what an arm. But he's taken what the defenses have given, and I think that's been coached into him. I think Mike Yurcich has done a really good job with him. Yurcich was the guy who recruited him, and he's kind of Yurcich's guy. I don't want that to come across the wrong way, but Bo Pribula, the other quarterback, he had already committed to Penn State. He was in the same class as Allar, but he had already committed before Yurcich arrived, and he's been a good backup for them. But I think he's been coached to do that again, to going back to what I said about Franklin. It's okay if you throw the ball away and settle for, you give yourself the right to punt and then get after them on the next drive. But the question I think everybody's wondering, and that it became a bit of a thing last week when one of the reporters asked Franklin, do you ever just want to let him just chuck it down the field? And people are wondering, are they going to really let that loose? When are they going to let that loose, or are they ever going to let it loose? And I think they've been fortunate enough to be in a position through 6 games that they have not had to rely on it. But sooner or later, you're probably going to have to rely on it, and it could be this week. So that's going to be one of the really fun things to keep an eye on. When you look at so many of these big games across the nation, how many of them are impacted by explosive plays? And going back to where, I came in on this discussion, that's been one of the things that Penn State just hasn't had. And again, is it a matter of that you haven't needed them, or you're incapable of doing it? I think from a passing perspective, the ability is there, especially with Keandre Lambert-Smith and Harrison Walls, who's back and healthy. And we saw some things out of Theo Johnson, the tight end, last week that he's starting to get back into it. I think the tools are there, but let's see if they're able to put it together, especially against an outstanding Ohio State team.
And it's nice to see that Franklin took that question about the downfield passing very well and did not in any way expose that reporter.
Well, the one thing Corey Geiger, who I'm friends with, he admitted that it wasn't necessarily asked in the best possible way. But yeah, I think James might have. Obviously, something was bugging him about that. And but you know what? It's when you're in UMass week and you have a video clip that you can post that people are going to talk about, that wasn't Ohio State week where we're going to have, people just all over content the whole week. That actually was pretty fun for us. And I think they ended up burying the hatchet anyway. Franklin called them. And I think all of it's water under the bridge at this point.
With 2 defenses both ranked in the top 10 scoring in total yards, and Penn State, I think, number 1 nationally against the run, there's a thought that this could be twice in this century. We've had games that ended up 13-6 and 13-7 in this rivalry. Ohio State won one of them on the Gamble interception in Columbus in 2002, the national championship season. Penn State won one in Columbus on the Terrell Pryor fumble play there, the night game in 2008. Does this set up as one of those low-scoring games? The odds makers have Ohio State -4.5, over under 48.5. So they're thinking 26-22. Last year it was like 44-31 or something absurd with 60, 70 points scored. We've seen that in some of these games in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even with points scored. What is your thought of the tenor of this game? Is it going to be in the 20s, the 30s, or the 50s, or the 60s? What do you think?
I think it's going to be in each team scoring in the 20s.
Yeah.
I just think the days of those super low scoring games, I just think both teams have too many athletes, and even if an offense can't get it going, I think either of these defenses is capable of scoring. I think both teams have special teams guys who are capable of scoring. So I just think the days of 13 to 12 or whatever the hell some of those scores were are behind us. I just think both of these teams have too much talent for it to be that low scoring, Steve. So I think it's going to be both teams in the 20, but I do think both teams are really good defensively. And I think both teams are really well coached. One of the things to me about this game is, who's going to make the most mistakes. Penn State had its first offensive turnover of the season last week. And again, I just think that's one of those things with both of these teams. I haven't looked at Ohio State closely enough, but I know how good of a coach Ryan Day is, that, ball security is always gigantic. And I think that's going to be a big part of what goes down in this game. And the other thing that I will say is that I really loved what Day said after that Notre Dame game about people questioning Ohio State's toughness. This is from the outside, looking in. And that's not something I ever looked at Ohio State and said that. I don't know where that narrative came from. And I guess if it's from a couple games against Michigan or whatever, but I think most people at Penn State have always respected the level of toughness out of Ohio State, along with the athletic ability and the talent and everything else. And I think most people really respect Ryan Day as a coach as well.